Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, good evening and welcome. Let me start by welcoming the patron of the 2nd 16th Association, Major General the Honourable Len Robert Smith, RFD KC, and Mrs Robert Smith. Could I also welcome Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Davidson, the CEO of the 16th Battalion Royal West Australian Regiment, and Warrant Officer Class 1 Ross Peck, the RSM of 16R WAR. Brigadier David Thompson is the former commander of 13 Brigade. Welcome, David. Are you here?
Yeah, hiding.
And two former CEOs of the regiment, of the battalion, I beg your pardon, Lieutenant Colonel Lachlan Bromley and Lieutenant Colonel Lee Partridge. It also gives me pleasure to welcome Nan Harper, the daughter of Brigadier Potts. Always nice to see you, Nan. And Richard James, our orator for 2026, who's come all the way from Melbourne with his daughter Clara. Welcome to you both. They're making the most of their visit. They've been to the zoo today and tomorrow they're going to Rottnest. There's no ferry running, but I understand they've got other arrangements. Could I also welcome Caitlin Wills, the cadet speaker, who you'll hear from a little bit later, and Matthew Lindberg, who's from Bunbury Cadet Unit and is going to be given a presentation a little bit later on. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all. To begin with, could I ask the Guildford Grammar School Cadet Unit Scholarship winner, Caitlin Willis, who's going to talk about her Kokoda experience.
Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. When I was first asked to speak today, I found it difficult to work out what exactly I could say that would do justice to the history and courage of the Kokoda track. When the opportunity came up to go on the experience of walking the track, retracing the steps of the battalions many years before us, I was interested and a bit excited. I would be able to possibly see where my great-grandfather Albert Hill of the 39th Australian Army Employment Company had helped build and work at the port facilities in Port Moresby during World War II. Although he never talked about his experiences to his family, we believe that there was a Japanese bombing raid around Christmas 1943, where many of his comrades were killed. I have been told he was part of the burial party which was assisted by the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. Kokoda is not something you fully understand by reading about it. It's something you feel, in your legs, in the heat, in the silence of the jungle, and in the moments when you realise just how far you still have to go. Last September, I stood at the start of the track with a backpack that felt manageable, a sense of excitement being with my group from Guildford Grammar School, and a huge sense of trepidation that I was about to embark on the hardest experience of my life. Very quickly, the track strips things back. The terrain is relentless, steep climbs that seem to go on forever, descents that test your balance and your focus, thick mud that makes every step heavier than the last. The air is humid, the jungle dense, and the time starts to feel different. You stop thinking in hours and start thinking in steps. Just get to the next tree. Just keep moving. And then you do it again. What surprised me most wasn't just about how physically demanding it was, but how constant it felt. There's no real break from it. Even when you stop, you know you'll have to start again. And yet, within that challenge, there were moments that I'll never forget. Early mornings where the jungle was completely still, except for the quiet sounds of people packing up around you. Standing on a ridge and looking out over layers upon layers of mountains, knowing you had walked through them. Arriving in villages where people welcomed you with a warmth that felt completely undeserved. And also the moments, the ones where people were struggling, where the group stretched out, where you could see how much effort it was taking to just keep going. Those were the moments that stayed with me the most, because that's where you saw what really mattered. You saw people slow down, even when they were exhausted themselves. You saw people offer encouragement, even when they probably needed it just as much. You saw quiet decisions being made to help, to wait, to support, without any expectation of recognition. And I began to realise that those small, almost invisible choices were what carried us forward. Learning about Brigadier Arnold Potts during and after experiencing the track gave those ideas a completely different weight. It's one thing to hear about leadership in difficult conditions. It's another to stand, even very briefly, in the same environment and try to imagine what it would have been like. Not just to walk it, but to lead through it, under pressure with responsibility for others. Potts didn't lead from a place of comfort or certainty. He led in conditions that were unpredictable, exhausting, and at times overwhelming. And yet what stands out is not just what he achieved, but how he carried himself, with resilience, with integrity, and with a clear sense of duty to his men. On Kokoda, I started to understand that leadership isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about awareness. It's about noticing when someone is struggling, even if they haven't said anything. It's about making the choice to act, to step in, to share the load, to stay alongside someone, even when it makes your own path harder. There was one afternoon in particular that I still think about. We were climbing for what felt like hours up the largest incline of the range. The track was steep, uneven, and the heat and humidity made everything more difficult. One person in our group was really struggling. You could see it in the way they moved, slower, more hesitant, each step taking more effort than the last. And yes, on that afternoon and many other afternoons, that person was me. No one made a big announcement. There was no moment where everything stopped, but gradually things shifted. Someone took part of my pack, someone else stayed close behind me. The pace adjusted, almost without anyone saying it, and we kept moving, together. At the time, it didn't feel like anything significant to anyone else. It just felt like what needed to happen. But looking back, I think that moment says a lot about what service actually looks like. It's not always visible, it's not always recognised, but it matters. Receiving the Brigadier Arnold Potts Award for Service at my school last year has made me reflect on those kinds of moments more deeply. Because service, at least from what I've seen and experienced, isn't defined by big gestures. It's defined by consistency. By the small decisions we make every day to include someone, to support someone, to do what's right, even when it would be easier not to. Kokoda didn't make things easier for me. If anything, it showed me how challenging things can be, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But it gave me a different perspective. It reminded me that progress doesn't have to be fast to be meaningful. That resilience is never about never struggling. That resilience isn't about never struggling, but about continuing anyway, even with full body aches from going downhill and uphill so much. But as my dad said before leaving, remember everything you are going through, the soldiers went through, but at least you aren't in the midst of a war. And that the people around you can make even the hardest situations manageable. Credit must go to our leaders along with the teachers from Guildford who helped me through the most difficult times. As students at Guildford Grammar, we don't face the same conditions or challenges as those on the Kokoda track, but we are still given opportunities every day to show the same values, to lead with integrity, to act with awareness, and to support the people around us, even in small and quiet ways. Brigadier Arnold Potts' legacy is built on those values, not just on what he achieved, but on how he led and how he chose to serve others, even in the most difficult circumstances. Standing here today, I don't feel like I've done anything comparable to that, but I do feel that experiences like Kokoda come with a responsibility to carry those lessons forward, to remember that leadership is not about recognition, and to try, in whatever context we're in, to contribute in a way that supports others. Because in the end, it's not the biggest moments that define us. It's the choices we make step by step along the way. Thank you.
Wow. Isn't she amazing? Thank you, darling. You did a wonderful job and such a role model. And our future looks bright, doesn't it? Yes. And ironically, our son, is on the Kokoda track right at this moment, and several of the other people are as well. So we have a little gift for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my dear.
Thank you.
You summed that up beautifully. Wow. We have a presentation now for a Bunbury Cadet Piper, Matthew Lingberg. Where's Matthew? Come forward, please, Matthew. Where's Mary?
Just here.
Here we are.
So it's just to say thank you very much to Matthew, who played at the 2nd 16th function in Bunbury last year and who is soon to be going with his band to America. So we will be contributing to your GoFundMe page.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think if I look in this cabinet, there's another parcel here. And this one's for Matthew, isn't it? Am I right?
Whoops.
We got there. Ladies and gentlemen, many years ago, the Israeli Defence Attaché to Australia told me that in 1982, the Israeli army used the same tactical plan to cross the Litani River in Lebanon that the Australian army used in 1941. What I didn't know until last week was what that tactical plan had been. But thanks to Richard James, I now know what that plan was by reading his superbly researched and very well written book, Australia's War with France, The Campaign in Syria and Lebanon, 1941. Richard is an author and historian and is here from Melbourne to give this year's Brigadier Arnold Potts Oration. It's no surprise that the Israelis chose the Australian plan because Moshe Dayan, the famous Israeli military leader and later defence minister, was there in Lebanon in 1941 fighting with the Australians. Moshe Dayan lost his eye during that fighting and thereafter was always readily recognised by the black eye patch that he wore. There were other notable casualties during that 1941 campaign in Lebanon and Syria. A young lieutenant by the name of Roden Cutler lost his leg while fighting there, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross for his heroism over a period of 19 days. Arnold Potts was also there as a major, and he was awarded a Distinguished Service Order. At Daymore, a French destroyer approached the shore and started shelling the Australian position. Richard has written that everyone went to ground except for Arnold Potts. Arnold stood up and yelled in the direction of the ship, "Well, here we are. Have a go." Later in the campaign, Arnold Potts took command of the 2nd 16th Battalion, and from there he was chosen to command the 21st Brigade. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Richard James to give the 2026 Brigadier Arnold Potts Oration.
Thank you very much for that. Please bear with me for a second while I try and bring up this presentation. Is anyone more familiar with? Is that what I have to press? Thanks very much for having me, first of all. I'm very glad to be here to be able to talk to you today a bit more about the history of the 2nd 16th Battalion. And I'm glad that Caitlin was able to tell you about her experiences on the Kokoda track, because I'd also like to actually maybe start there and tell you a little bit about my own experiences walking Kokoda, because that was really the thing that got me interested in all this in the first place. You know, I was possibly not that much older. Maybe I was 20 years old or so. And, I had a very similar experience where, it was hard work. And I remember the blisters on my feet, and I remember being sick to the stomach and not being able to hold food down, like trudging through the mud with this heavy pack, on my shoulders. And we got about halfway through the track and emerged at this spot, Brigade Hill, sort of this bare knoll, kind of a clearing in sticking out of the jungle. It was sort of cold and drizzling, and we were almost up above the clouds, above the mist. And there were these rows of wooden stakes in the ground, about 50 of them, and that was an Australian cemetery, or they were marking Australian graves, where all the men who'd fought on Brigade Hill that particular day, killed in that area, including, I think, more than 30 from the 2nd 16th Battalion, were brought back and buried in that spot, and stayed there until they were taken back to the Bomana War Cemetery in Moresby. But it was quite a moving experience to stand on that spot, amongst those grave sites. And that was, for me, really the first time that I heard the story of what had happened there at Brigade Hill, and heard about what some of the men from the 2nd 16th Battalion had been through on that particular day. And it was really quite a moving experience. I'd never, at that time in my life, had to think about some of these concepts like courage or sacrifice, as a young person. And, we were standing there, the group of us trekkers, listening to this history, literally with tears coming down our faces. It was quite a moving experience for me. And so we sort of, after hearing that, we set off again and started trudging along the track. And another 4 or 5 days passed, and eventually got to the end. And I remember, throwing my pack down and collapsing on the ground and thinking, oh gosh, thank God that's finished, and I don't have to do that again. And so went home after that to, back to sort of the comforts of home, but found myself, in the weeks that followed that experience, reflecting and thinking more and more about what I'd heard about Brigade Hill. And sure enough, the next year I decided to go back to Kokoda and do it again and hear it all again. And subsequently again the next year. I really wanted to start learning everything that I could about the history of the campaign. I started working as a historical guide on the track. That was sort of one of my first jobs, taking people up there and teaching them about the history. And I also wanted to learn about the story of the men from the 2nd 16th and the other battalions that were up there, how they'd come to be in that situation, what had prepared them for that and where they'd come from. So that really spurred me on to learn about the campaign that came before that, which was in Syria and Lebanon. Started researching that, went over there and tried to sort of follow in the footsteps of where the men had been, following the battles that they'd fought in Lebanon. And the other thing, I guess, was that I was really keen to try and meet some of these men whose stories I'd heard. And I count myself very lucky to have had that opportunity to meet a lot of the veterans, and they were kind enough to invite me to their homes and share some of their experiences with me. And so I suppose that it's some of those stories that they passed on to me that I'd like to share with you tonight. And I'm also very aware that, in the room tonight are family members of a lot of those veterans, and obviously people that you knew not as war veterans, but as fathers and grandfathers and husbands. So, my own connection to some of these people was obviously a lot briefer. And so I hope perhaps by sharing my story, maybe it can add a different perspective or just a small piece of the puzzle to these men that you already know and love that aren't with us anymore. Let's see here. One in particular was Keith Norrish, and I met Keith when he was in his early 90s and here in Perth, and I got the chance to ask him about his experiences. In particular, I was interested in how he came to sign up for the battalion in the first place. The context being he was a sort of a kid from the country, from Cranbrook, a great shot with a .22 rifle. And he, I think, was 19 years old when the war broke out, when Britain declared war on Germany. And he said that he just hitched a ride down to the recruitment office and said, I just thought that seemed to be the right thing to do at the time, was to go and sign up. And he said he got to the front of the queue And the man behind the desk was Arnold Potts. And he recognised Potts, who was almost a neighbour, who was running cattle a bit further up the road from him. And Keith's father, Richard, had actually fought alongside Potts. They were both in the original 16th Battalion. And in 1918, at the Battle of Hamel, Potts was shot and quite badly wounded, shot in the chest. And it was Keith's father, Richard, who actually carried Potts off the battlefield that particular day. And Potts then recovered to serve again in the next war. I don't think that the guys of Keith's generation probably knew any of those stories in much detail. It always really interested me what they thought they were signing up for, what they knew about war or really what they were getting themselves into. Another veteran from the 2nd 16th by the name of Max Beattie, who I asked the same question to, he said something along the lines of, I had a bunch of uncles in the Great War, and when I told them I was going to sign up, they said, you're a bloody idiot, you don't. And he said, that's all they told me, but that I wanted to do it anyway. So, he and Keith, and there was about 800 of them, or 850 or so, about that age, maybe early 20s was the age that most of them were. They got together at Northam Camp, and that's where most of them encountered Potts for the first time. He wasn't the battalion commander at that point. He was the second in charge of the battalion, but he was really the one who was responsible for training the guys and for discipline. And by the sound of it, he was quite a taskmaster. Bill Graydon, who I'm sure you're familiar with, one of the original officers in the battalion, his recollections were that Potts would sort of push them hard, almost to the point of trying to break them, but that they really respected him for that. I think Potts understood that leadership is sort of something that it's not bestowed automatically just from your rank. It's really something that you have to earn. You have to earn the respect of those people that you're leading. But by all reports, Potts was the one who was really responsible for, I suppose, forging the spirit of the battalion while they were training at Northam. The expectation was that they would go and fight in France against the Germans. I mean, that's sort of what they thought was going to happen. That's what their parents' generation had done. But, of course, while they were training was when France surrendered to Germany. All in a matter of a few weeks, the German blitzkrieg came through, and the war in Europe was effectively over in a matter of weeks. This is I've just got a few photos from as we talk through the story. So they, after spending the best part of the year of 1940 at Northam, in I think October of 1940 was when they left Australia from Fremantle, and they didn't really know where they were going or where they'd be fighting or who they'd be fighting against. It was really a big unknown. It took them a few months, but they arrived, disembarked in Egypt, and they sort of were sort of ferried back and forth. They spent a few months in Palestine. This is a great photo of a 2nd 16th training exercise. They spent a few months there. They were then sent to Egypt, and then they were at a spot called Mersa Matruh, basically just on garrison duty, well back from the front line. And it was really the 6th Division who at that stage were doing most of the fighting. They were the ones fighting in the Western Desert, Tobruk and then subsequently Greece, and they were the ones kind of getting all the accolades. And you sort of hear the recollections of the men from the 7th Division or read some of the diary entries, and there's this real feeling of them kind of itching to get their chance to get into the fight and really prove themselves. They thought that it was the guys from the 6th Division who were getting all the accolades while they were being left behind, and that there was a bit of a power struggle going on behind the scenes between General Blamey and General Laverack, who was the divisional commanders. But eventually They came back to Palestine, and then the orders came through that they would be going into fight. The surprise being that it wouldn't be against the Germans, it was going to be against the French. So from their base in Palestine, just above them was the territories of Syria and Lebanon. And those were French-mandated territories, almost like colonies. They had French armies. They were officered by people from mainland France, and most of the troops were colonial troops from North Africa or from some of the local countries. And under the terms of the armistice between Germany and France, those territories and the armies in them were supposed to be neutral, and they were supposed to just kind of sit out the war and not fight, possibly be disarmed. But of course, the British didn't like this arrangement or didn't trust this arrangement. They were worried that maybe somehow the Germans would be able to make use of those territories. And so they wanted to sort of preemptively put a stop to that. They had their hands full in the Western Desert on one side fighting against Rommel and the Germans, and they didn't want a war on two fronts. They didn't want Germans or anyone else coming from the other side to sort of do a pincer on them from their base in Egypt. So it was a bit of a preemptive strike. And the Australians, the guys from the 7th Division, were sort of the only troops in the area who were still available. So they were the ones who were earmarked to be sent in. And this is a photo of them. They were kind of hidden out in these olive groves and orchards in Palestine, or what was Palestine at the time, waiting for the order to cross the border. In this photo, you've got the brigadier at the time, who was Jack Stevens, who's got the number 5 there, and that all the battalion commanders sitting around getting their orders for the campaign. There was this conception amongst the high command that the French soldiers who were there probably weren't going to put up a fight, because they'd been on the same side of the Allies up until months before, and it was thought that maybe if this Allied force came through with a kind of show of force, that the French might just lay down their arms and let them through, and that turned out to be false. But the order that the Aussies got was that, when you go across the border and go into fight, don't wear your helmets. We want you wearing your slouch hats, in the hope that the French on the other side will recognise them and say, oh, it's the Australians. Maybe remember that the Australians were fighting in France to save France in the previous war. But as you'll hear, that wasn't the way it worked out. It was a fierce campaign. The 2nd 16th was part of a column attacking closest to the coast, so in Lebanon, across the border, right near the Mediterranean, heading north for Beirut. Next to them was another column, which was another Australian brigade, the 25th Brigade, heading through the mountains, and then further inland, another group of Allied troops, mainly actually Indian troops, heading through the desert in Syria towards Damascus. So the 2nd 16th was at the head of this column near the coast. Their first obstacle was a river, the Litani River. And there was, the first guys that went across were in some motor vehicles. Potts was part of that advance group, and another was Frank Sublett, another one of the original officers from the campaign, and who also went on to command the battalion later in the war. And Sublett's got some great recollections of the Syrian campaign. He says that they were driving along this road and there was nothing to be seen from, no enemy soldiers, all quiet. And he said he thought, oh, well, maybe it is going to be a nothing. Maybe we're just going to drive all the way to Beirut and that'll be it. And sure enough, as soon as he thought that, bang, the shells started exploding around him. And this was as they came towards the river. There was an old bridge which the French blew up. They had explosives on there, so the Aussies couldn't get across. The French were dug in on the other side, kind of on the high ground, and the troops in this particular instance were mainly, I think, Algerian, as I said, with French officers. I mean, and they'd been sitting there for the last 6 months with nothing better to do than they were digging in their trenches, putting up barbed wire, sighting their machine guns. It was an extremely well-defended position. And Sublett said, we were immediately under this heavy fire, and it was the first time that most of the men had come under fire. And he said it was, this visceral feeling of fear that you're going to die. Like it's an unavoidable feeling. We couldn't get rid of it, or we couldn't overcome it. And I just had to control it. I was a platoon commander. I had to set an example for my men, and we went in. The only way they could get across the river they brought these little folding boats with them to try and somehow kind of get themselves across. And you can see it's a significant river to try and get across. One of the men from the 2nd 16th, Alan Haddy, whose name you're probably familiar with, he volunteered to be the first to go across, and he jumped into the river and swam across under fire with a rope in his hand so he could get to the other side and tie it up. And so the Australians could then try and haul themselves across on these little boats, whilst they were under fire from machine guns and mortars on the other side. A few platoons got across. They were pinned down, below the ridge, and the French up the top were firing on them and rolling grenades down the hill. And they were stuck there for most of the day till eventually, some of the guys were able to get around the flank on the higher ground, and they were able to get up onto the ridge and take the French position. That was their first experience of battle. You can see Alan Haddy on the right there, who fought through that campaign. Fought in Kokoda, and tragically he was killed. In New Guinea on the northern beaches. At the end of 1942, and then in this photo, Peter Dungy was killed in Syria in one of the later battles. They had maybe a day or two of rest before going back into the fight. The next obstacle was the town of Sidon, and that was a really tough fight. The French had these tanks. The Allies had no opposition to that, no armoured force of their own. So the guys from the 16th were trying to make their way through this series of orchards just short of the town, right near the coast. And it was the middle of the night, and they were sort of pinned down here while the tanks were roaming around the streets. It was this close hand-to-hand fighting. I think 2 of the company commanders were killed in this particular battle, Captain Hawley, Captain Inkpen. So it was a real tough, close fight. And in the battalion diaries, it's been given the name Black Friday because it was such a shock. So many of these guys were killed. And eventually another battalion, some South Australians, were able to, the same sort of story as previously, get around in the hills further inland and outflank the defence. And it was actually Potts himself who was the first man to get into the town of Sidon and sort of accept the surrender of the town. It was a great story of him being basically on his own, on foot, with nothing more than a revolver. And he'd rounded up a few French prisoners along the way and was herding them into town. So certainly Potts was always there, leading from the front. But some incredible history that they were fighting through Roman ruins and here Crusader castles, a place that's just been at war for thousands of years, basically. They then had a break for a few weeks. The brigade that was fighting a little further inland in the mountains got held up not far past the border. It was incredibly difficult country to fight in. And so Laverack, who was in charge of the campaign, he was worried that they shouldn't progress along the coast too far without the brigade beside them because it would expose the flank. So they were sort of held up for a few weeks, kind of waiting for the others. This is the guys from the 2nd 16th fusing grenades while they're waiting for the next and final battle that they entered in Lebanon was at Damour. And once again, a steep river crossing, the French on the other side on the high ground. This is a great photo giving you an idea of the terrain that they were fighting in. In this instance, it was French Foreign Legion troops who were on the opposite side. and the Australians went in across the river and tried to get up these gullies, and that's where the story of Potts. They started getting shelled from destroyers, ships off the coast, hitting the positions, and I think it's a great story showing the fact that of Potts's bravery, obviously, but just the fact that he was. It's like every time, he was always there beside the men when the going got tough. He wasn't giving orders from behind. He was there with them and was recognised rightfully for his leadership, promoted to command the battalion after this campaign. That after the Battle of Damour, not long after that there was an armistice. So the French surrendered in Beirut, and the British were able to take over. They spent quite a long time in Lebanon and Syria after that, maybe about 3 to 4 months just on garrison duty. By that stage, the war had began on the Eastern Front, so Hitler had invaded the Russians, and really the focus of the war had shifted away from the Middle East where they were. And then, of course, in the December of 1941, you had Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the beginning of the war in the Pacific, and obviously the war getting a lot closer to home. So that's when the troops quickly were brought back to Australia as soon as they could. They had a few months back in Australia, very hurried jungle training up in Queensland, and then they were sent up to Papua New Guinea in the August of 1942, a few days in Port Moresby, and then they were up on the Kokoda track. Now, Potts by this stage had been promoted to the brigadier, so he was now in charge of the entire brigade. The 2nd 16th men still thought of Potts as Pottsy as their leader, but now he was in charge of 3 battalions. He first engaged the Japanese at the Battle of Isarava. That was the 2nd 14th that mainly fought that particular battle. And Potts knew that he couldn't really hold that valley, the Eora Valley it's called. His orders were to advance to Kokoda and push the Japanese off the track. Well, he simply didn't have the men or the supplies to do that. He was outnumbered. He held Isarava as long as he could. The Japanese were able to outflank him. He had no choice but to pull back. His next order was to hold what they called the Kokoda Gap. So this was the highest part of the range, and it was the spot where the Australians were dropping supplies. So it was quite a critical point from a strategic point of view. I guess the commanders back in Australia looked at the map and saw this Kokoda Gap, and maybe they had in mind like a mountain pass where a few hundred people could hold off the Persian army type setup. Well, if you get up there and see it, it's like a flat plateau. It's about 10 kilometres wide. It's completely indefensible no matter how many troops you had. So Potts had no choice but to disobey his orders, withdraw from that spot back into the next valley through the village there called a Fogey, and found a spot that he thought was defensible at least for some amount of time. That was really what the campaign was, just trying to buy time, hold the track for as long as he could before falling back. So the track there through that next village starts winding up to the next ridge where there was an old mission hut, a Seventh-day Adventist hut, and the troops called it Mission Ridge. And so that Potts at that stage brought a fresh battalion forward, the guys from South Australia, the 2nd 27th, put them on the track down in the valley, and they dug in, and they were the ones expected to take on the brunt of the fight. They were the fresh troops, whereas the 2nd 16th, as well as the Victorians from the 2nd 14th that had been in the jungle for the best part of a month now. So the South Australians were dug in there. The track winds its way up a couple of kilometres till it gets to the very top, which is Brigade Hill, the clearing in that original photo. And that's where the 2nd 16th were, as well as the 2nd 14th, on one side of the hill. And Potts put his headquarters on the other side of the clearing, just a little bit out of the way. And it's interesting speaking to some of the veterans about this particular day, such as Bill Graydon or Keith Norrish, who were up on Brigade Hill. They said that they were just standing around. They weren't dug in. They weren't expecting to fight at all. They were expecting the fight to happen 2 kilometres further down the track, which it certainly did. Dawn came on that particular day, and the Japanese attacked the South Australians down on Mission Ridge. But at the same time, they'd sent a group around the valley to the side of the Australians through and up what's effectively a cliffside, the kind of terrain that you have to see it to believe it, that they were able to get up this. It's no wonder Potts didn't, thought that this was a good spot to try and defend, as good as you could find. But, Bill Graydon said we were sitting around, it was the middle of the night, and we could hear the chopping of wood with axes and the rustling of leaves and shouting. And we knew exactly what was happening, which was that the Japanese were getting in behind us. But there was nothing we could do. It was the middle of the night. It was pitch dark. So sure enough, morning came and it became clear that Potts had been cut off from the soldiers on the other side. He was still in radio contact. So he was speaking with Albert Carra, who was the battalion commander of the 2nd 16th, and said to Carra, well, I need you guys to attack backwards towards me along the track to see if we can clear it out of the Japanese. They weren't sure how many were there or how well dug in they were. So Bill said, we lined up. There was I think there were 3 companies in that attack, a few hundred guys. The track sort of flattens out at this spot. He said, we lined up, on either side of the track, 100 metres or so, and we just walked into the Japanese. We had no attempt to conceal our position. All we could do was just walk into the fire and try and draw the fire from the Japanese to try and figure out where they were. And it was the kind of country where you wouldn't know someone was there until you literally would step on them or it was this hand-to-hand, close proximity fighting. And that attack failed. They didn't make it through to Potts. Or of the 300 or so that went in, only around 10 of them made it through. And Bill Graydon was one of those 10 who got to Potts on the other side. Another one was a veteran by the name of Jack Scott, and he tells a great story of he was crawling through the bush and parted some leaves, and Potts was there on the other side staring right back at him. And Potts said, how the bloody hell did you get here? And Jack sort of pointed back in the way he'd come. And then Potts said, oh, well, could you get back that way if you had to? And Jack said, I didn't. I just looked at him and didn't say anything. And he sort of understood, what that meant. And so Potts, the first attack having failed, Potts had with him a couple of platoons. Here's a photo of Bill. Couple of platoons that were guarding the headquarters, and that was commanded by Captain Breton Langridge. Lefty Langridge was his nickname, which they called him because actually in the first battle in Lebanon at the Latana, he'd been shot in the right hand and couldn't use it. So after that, they called him Lefty. But he was the officer in charge of that group, and so Potts then gave the order, well, if the main troops couldn't get to us from that side, we'll try and attack back to make contact with them from the other side. If 300 Australians couldn't clear the track, what chance did this smaller group have? But I think, under the circumstances, I don't think there was any other option. What were they going to do? Just turn around and walk back to Moresby and say, oh, we left the rest of the battalions up on the track. I think everyone understood that they had to make this effort to try and clear the track. But Langridge, understood what this order really meant. And, there's a sad story that it's told. The story is told by another veteran by the name of David Kayla Thompson. And he said that, Langridge got the order and he knew what this meant. And he pulled out his pay book and handed it over to Kayla Thompson. And the other lieutenant with them, Henry Lambert, he pulled out a tobacco, his prized tin of tobacco and tossed it over. They sort of knew that this was their last moments, basically. And sure enough, they went in and both of them were killed within a few minutes. And actually, incredibly, Bill Graydon, who'd made it through to Potts' side, he was ordered to go with them back into the battle that he'd just come from, which I think is quite extraordinary. That he'd already earlier in the morning been on a patrol where they'd tried to discern where the Japanese were. And he just the guy crawling up in front of him had been shot, and he just narrowly managed to get away. So this was the third engagement he'd done on that particular day, and he was there beside both Langridge and Lambert when they were killed. And that attack failed, and then that was kind of the end. That Potts then had no choice really but to withdraw. He sort of turned around with the men he had and went back in the Moresby direction to the next village, which is Minari. The guys who were still stuck on Brigade Hill, they'd managed to cut a track through the jungle, and they got back to Minari in time with Potts, and so were able to retreat. Keith Norris, who I talked about, also had an extraordinary experience. He was part of the attack, the first attack, trying to get towards Potts. He had a mate, he was a mate by the name of Ozzy Osborne. They were both section leaders when they had, both of them had Thompson machine guns. But he said, we were firing these guns just on a single shot to try and make sure we didn't run out of ammunition. And so I'd sort of take cover and fire while Ozzy went forward, and then we'd sort of leapfrog each other. And then Ozzy got shot in the head, in the helmet, and he collapsed on one side of a log. And Keith said he was stuck there, and he ran out of ammunition for his gun, and he could see, Ozzy draped over this log, and there were some ammunition pouches for the Thompson gun, and he thought, I'll take those. He said he reached over to grab it, and there was a Japanese on the other side who fired a burst at him from just a metre away. And Keith happened to have in his pocket a mirror with a steel backing, as well as a bunch of letters from his fiancée. And I think 3 or 4 of the bullets were absorbed by this. It's sort of something you'd hear in a movie. These bullets deflected off the mirror, and that's probably what saved his life. One bullet did penetrate his chest, punctured his lung, and he said he was lying there, for God knows how long, in and out of consciousness with like a pink foam coming out of his mouth from his lung being punctured. And then the story's taken up by the medical officer from the 16th by the name of Blue Stewart, who said that someone was able to get hold of Keith and bring him, as well as Ozzy, who was still alive. He said that Ozzy had a shot right through the tip of his helmet, and it had cracked the helmet in half, but he wasn't really badly hurt. And he said, Stewart said to Ozzy, you're lucky, mate. And Ozzy's reply was something like, they're lousy shots, Doc, Keith, though, Stewart says that all he had to help Keith was a bunch of sulfur tablets, like a very basic antiseptic. And he said that Keith had the bullet wound going through his chest, a big exit wound in the back. And Stewart said, I crushed some of these tablets in the wound, put a bandage on, and I physically pulled Keith up by the shirt, turned him around and said, all right, Keith, Port Moresby's 5 days walk that way, and pushed him down the track. And sure enough, Keith made it back to Moresby. And having, it's just something that you honestly can't imagine it, having walked the Kokoda track. First of all, that he made it back to Minari before the Japanese and was able to then get out. And then subsequently all the way back to Port Moresby. Just one final anecdote was, another veteran by the name of Jim Moyer, who, Jim, I went and saw, went and visited him back at home in Perth. This was, a long time ago now. And I wanted to ask him about his experiences in Lebanon. And he sort of, he was kind of blunt with me and said, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about the war. he was really quite short with me, saying he didn't want to talk, which was fine by me. And we just chatted about his family and about, his life after the war. And then, unprompted, he did start describing what had happened at Brigade Hill. And you could tell that he was conflicted, it was obviously causing him some angst to recall this. But on the other hand, he sort of wanted to talk about it. And he said that he was shot in that first attack, shot through the hip, and with an exit wound, a big hole down near his groin. And he was lying there in the jungle as the battle went to and fro. He said it's a wonder that the Japanese didn't come and just stick a bayonet in him. He was just lying there, and said he was looking around and thought, oh gosh, fancy. Can you imagine dying in a spot like this? Eventually, one of the stretcher bearers, a guy by the name of Jono Johnson, was able to get to Jim and dragged him out. And Jim said, they laid me down, they put a blanket over the top of me. Presumably they thought he wasn't going to make it. But he said that someone leaned over and whispered to him, Jim, don't worry, mate, we're not going to leave you behind. He said that really meant something to him, that they'd said, we're not going to leave you, Jim. And sure enough, Jim, as well as a bunch of others, obviously on stretchers, they tried to bush bash off Brigade Hill, but didn't get back to Minari because they were carrying stretchers. They didn't get there on time. By the time they got there, the Japanese were, Potts and whoever else could have made it had to retreat, and the Japanese were there. So they had to turn around and go back into the jungle. And they spent an entire month in the bush trying to make their way out somewhere along the track. Jim had no medical attention whatsoever, like nothing at all, and no rations. They had no supply. They were just scrounging in native gardens to try and get something to eat. But the guys didn't leave him behind. On the main track they had the Papuan carriers to help bring in supplies and bring out wounded. But for groups like this, it was just the Australians carrying each other out. And so, a month later, Keith made it out into hospital in Port Moresby. And, I think, that's something that sticks with you. There's the memorial up there now on Kokoda, which is at the Isarava battle site. The veterans from that campaign, they played a very significant role in the design of that memorial, and they were the ones who chose the words that are written there: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. I think it's a kind of and the word mateship in particular, I think, is one that stands out. A kind of mateship that's not really something perhaps that exists anymore, where your mate's literally got your life in his hands and vice versa. And I think that's one of the reasons that we get some of these incredible stories of survival from Kokoda. And, the reason why the Australians made it out of the prisoner of war camps at higher rates of survival than some of the other nationalities, because they looked after their mates, and the officers looked after the men. Everyone sort of looked out for each other. You'd ask when I would ask these guys a question like, how did you do that? Like, how did you find the courage to do these things? That the answer invariably would be, well, my mates were depending on me, or the battalion expected it of me. And the battalion was your mates. I think that for me personally, that's been the thing that's motivated me. It's really these personal experiences, probably more so than the details of the battles themselves. These were sort of very humble men, or modest men. I think of Keith saying, I just signed up because it was the right thing to do, or Bill Graydon describing, in a very matter-of-fact way, this extraordinary series of things he went through, or, Potts as well, who understood that leadership was something you had to earn, and earn through actions rather than words. I think these were all people who understood that they were part of something bigger than themselves, and really just did what was required of them in that particular moment, and I think that's really, a display of a particular kind of courage, accepted in the moment and faithfully carried out. I think it's an extraordinary responsibility that was asked of these guys. Hopefully for us, not something that we'll have to be put in that position. But I think, we have a responsibility nonetheless, simply to remember, as honestly as we can. I think, in the telling and writing of history, there's always a bit of a worry that you're contributing to creating some kind of myth. I've perhaps been guilty of this, where the truth gets polished to a point where it's not, it's something else than what actually happened. But I always think it comes back to, as I said, trying to remember, as honestly as we can what happened. All these veterans are now gone. They've all passed away, and it's us who are the custodians of that history. So, thank you very much for listening, for giving me the chance to tell some of the stories. And, I hope we can be faithful to that responsibility to remember. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. And to offer a vote of thanks, Mary's organising it down the back, so don't go away. Mary? Who's saying the vote of thanks? We're totally unscripted here, Richard.
On behalf of the 2nd 16th Association, we'd like to thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting, and I'm sure we're going to.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings to a close the more formal part of the evening, but before you all head towards the bar, could I please remind you again of the silent auction, which is just over there, and it doesn't close until 9:15. And there's some great things there to purchase. And could I also ask you to thank the committee of the 2nd 16th Battalion Association for organising tonight and for the work they do throughout the year. They are Vice Presidents Mary Goldthorpe and Jim Graydon, Secretary Peter Norrish, Treasurer Mary Price, Pigeon Post co-editors Margaret Smith and Davina Goldthorpe, and the committee of John Murdoch, Phil and Faye Utting, Penny Thomas, Anna Pollard, Ken Walker and Wayne Kosh. They all look forward to seeing you again on the 20th of August 2027 for next year's oration. Please enjoy the refreshments.
On behalf of the association, I'd like to thank Jeff for being the MC once again. Just a small token of our appreciation. Thank you very much. And just on a personal note, there's been a canvas bag in our house for the last 80 plus years. And I never knew what was in it until a few years ago, and I emptied out the contents. They're on the table over here. And until I read Richard's book, I didn't understand what the 22 was on the front of the Foreign Legion hat. And it's one of the Foreign Legion units, and he mentions it in his book. But there's a couple of fezzes, the Foreign Legion cap, obviously from that campaign, and the flag rolled up in a bag I always thought was a Lebanese flag. I just unrolled it, red and white, and thought that's Lebanese, until I Googled it. It's an Italian army flag, obviously souvenired when they were out around Mersa Matruh. All that was offered to the West Australian Army Museum, but they weren't interested in it. It's not for sale tonight, but that flag, the equivalent of it, is currently on eBay for $841. It's, as Peter said earlier, they're not for sale, sorry. They've been in the family for over 80 years, and that's where they're staying. Thank you all for attending.